So, which of these three do you think Gyges was? Remember the guy with the ring, right? He turns the ring and he becomes invisible, and then he wanders around. He can take anything he wants. He ends up killing the king. He ends up sleeping with the queen. He ends up taking the place of the king. Was he a moral realist, do you think? Did he believe in an objective good and evil? Probably not. I think I agree with you. Because if he did think that things like killing and stealing were objectively wrong, then he certainly ought not to have done what he did. Of course, he may have still believed that, but been weak, like morally weak. We all know that, right? We know what it feels like to know something to be wrong, but to find yourself still ending up doing it. But as I read the story, as I remember it, I don't think he had any, pangs of conscience. He just, because he knew he could get away with it, he thought that's the right thing to do. Was he a moral relativist, do you think? Well, you're saying no? A nihilist. Okay, so if he was a nihilist, then he thinks there is no good or evil, right? And he just, whatever he feels like he does it, maybe that might be the case. I think you could make a case for him possibly having been a relativist in the sense that maybe he did have a moral code, and his moral code was me, me, me. Right? That's a kind of moral code, right? The most important thing is me getting what I want. That is the good of the universe, for me to get what I want. And he was pretty faithful to that moral code, if that's what he did. But of course, that's the kind of moral code that you can't possibly universalize, right? You can't impose that moral code on everyone. It's impossible for everyone to say, what I want is the most important thing, because then we have a clash. And nobody will accept it if I say to all of you, what I want is the most important thing. Serve me, give me everything that I want, and I don't care about what happens to you. Well, you could have that code, but you wouldn't last for very long, I don't think. So, yeah, who knows? Possibly, very likely a nihilist, quite possibly a relativist, highly unlikely that he was a realist. And you can see now why this matters, right? Because what you think about good and evil, the nature of good and evil, has a very big impact on how you behave. One of the things that we often say pastorally in the church is, the nature of your heart, not when you do good things and people see you. It's the good things that you do when no one can see you that really tells the kind of person that you are. And on the other side, the evil that you do when no one can see you. This is what kind of really reveals who you really are. Because, in a way, a lot of us are kind of nihilists. A lot of us are Gyges, deep down inside. Although we're kind of restricted by what people's expectations are, if you took those restrictions away, a lot of us may behave differently. So you wouldn't do that if you were completely and utterly convinced that good and evil are like gravity. They're the laws of the universe, and that they ought to be followed, like even if nobody's watching, they still ought to be followed. So if there is no such thing as an objective good or evil, and even if you have an idea, you think something is good or evil, that really doesn't matter. We don't care. Then nothing matters, right? A world in which mass murder is normal, in which rape and violence are normal, is not a more evil world than a world in which everybody is a saint, right? Because there is no good and evil. There's nothing to measure it by. So whatever happens, just happens. It just is. There's no value judgment to be made about it. This is a really hard way for a human being to live their life. I sometimes wonder whether it's actually impossible for a human being to be a thorough 100% nihilist. I suspect it probably isn't. And so people who have felt intellectually that nihilism is right have still tried to find ways to get around that. So Friedrich Nietzsche is a famous philosopher from about 100 years ago. He's the one who famously said, God is dead. But when you actually read the bit in which he said, God is dead, it wasn't a cry of triumph. it was actually a warning. It was actually a lament. Because what he was saying is, if we no longer believe in God, what is going to happen to us? If you take away the reason we felt we ought to do good and restrain evil, when you take that reason away, what's going to be left? And his answer was, well, we have to step up and be gods ourselves. We have to be worthy of the challenge. And so he had this idea of the Übermensch, the Superman. Man must further evolve and develop and become his own God and make his own rules, give himself the right and the wrong, the good and the evil. But ultimately what he's really admitting is, if you accept nihilism, the best you can go from there to avoid mass murder and rape and violence and, horrible stuff, the best you can do is relativism. Like, you just make up good and evil for yourself and you hope that that will be the best. Now, nihilism, because it's so depressing, is one reason. Because it leads to such horrible consequences is another reason. Is not a very popular view, really. Whether among, I think, the general population, I don't think if you went in the street and asked some people, can anyone do anything they want? Is anything permitted? Most people would say, no, of course not. That's not true. And also philosophers think that that's not true. By and large, you will always be able to find a philosopher who will agree with a particular point of view. However crazy and weird it is, there is a philosopher somewhere in the world who thinks it's right. But generally, as a general sort of trend, it's not a very popular sort of view. And by the way, also, the person who is a nihilist must also accept that pretty much all of those people who reject nihilism are in some way deluded. They're just terribly, terribly mistaken about the nature of the world. Which, look, that may be the case, who knows, maybe we are all deluded, but I think there is some important value, some weight to the fact that the vast majority of people in the world have a very deep intuition that is very hard to shake, that there is actually good and evil in the world. You can't just get rid of good and evil altogether. Moral relativism. So this is the idea that everything is relative, good and evil are relative, and that therefore good and evil are in the eye of the beholder. This has some benefits. There are some things that made it very, very attractive, particularly in the second half of the 20th century. For example, it means you are more likely to be tolerant. You are more likely to be open-minded. Right? One of the things that we dislike in the modern world is the fanatic, the person who discriminates, the person who thinks their way of life is superior to everybody else's way of life. That's almost one of the modern major deadly sins, to think that you're better than other people and that you're right and other people are wrong. So relativism, moral relativism, is a way to get around that, right? Nobody gets to be right. At least nobody gets to be objectively right. We can all say, you're happy with your code, I'm happy with my code, let's all just tolerate each other, let's all just live together and, get on with our life. This sounds good, right? It means no one can judge another person, no culture can judge another culture. But it has some unexpected consequences, and this is what people gradually realized over time. For example, if you are a moral relativist, you cannot say that Adolf Hitler was objectively not as good a person as Mother Teresa of India. Right? You can't say that, because Adolf Hitler had his moral code and he was faithful to it. Mother Teresa had her moral code, she was faithful to it. That's it. That's all we can say. We can't say that one code was better than another. You cannot say that killing every Jewish person in the world is not as noble a goal as trying to heal every person with cancer in the world. You can't say that. That's just because you don't like cancer. That's just your opinion, right? You can't. And I don't like Jews. That's my opinion. And you have to tolerate my opinion. You can see this is problematic. I hope you can see this is problematic. I hope you can see this is not really how we think about things. Infanticide, like the Eskimos, is not more evil than preserving infant life. The abolition of slavery is not an objectively good or bad step for humanity. Right? The moral code that accepted and encouraged slavery is just as good as the moral code that wanted to get rid of slavery. Now, that's a historical way to look at it, but a way to really bring that point home is if a political party arose today and said, we want to bring back slavery, you can't say that's objectively wrong. Right? It just so happens that the majority of us don't agree with you, that's why we're going to stop you. But what you're arguing for is not actually wrong in itself. And if, as in the past, it was the other way around and the majority of people thought slavery was a good thing, well, that was perfectly okay. And the reformers who abolished slavery, well, they didn't really achieve anything in terms of good and evil. They didn't make things better. They just changed what is. So I hope you can see moral relativism, although it looks very attractive on the surface, has come to be realised, and once again, this is not just from a Christian or a religious point of view. This is in the philosophical world generally. It's come to be seen as really not a starter. It doesn't work. And if you think about it a little bit further, moral relativism in a way just collapses back down into nihilism. So I said a little bit earlier that the best the nihilists can do is kind of develop local moral codes that aren't binding on everyone, and that's how they might get along with life. So really I'm just saying the opposite now. If you look at a local moral code, really what you're admitting is that that is not binding on everyone, and therefore it's not part of the nature of reality, and therefore you're really admitting that there is no good and evil in reality, which is just nihilism. We're back to nihilism once again. Moral relativism just describes what people believe. Eskimos believe this, Australians believe that. It doesn't give you an ought, other than if you belong to this group, you ought to do what the group says. But that's not universally binding, right? I might want to change what my group says. I might think my group is wrong and lobby and work to try and change it. You can do that, that's okay, because it's not sort of a universal thing that isn't going to change. So moral relativism has no completely binding requirements to behave in one way or another. It's about what is and not about what ought to be. And in that sense, it really does just collapse back into nihilism. Which brings us to the third one, the moral realism. There really is an objective good and evil that doesn't depend on what anyone thinks about it, and that this good and evil applies to everyone, just as the law of gravity applies to everyone, even the gravity denier, if there is such a thing. So that means that every person ought to do what is good, regardless of what they personally or what their culture think about that. So Guy G's ought not to have stolen. He ought not to have killed and cheated, regardless of what he thought, regardless of whether he could get away with it. The clever IT person who can steal a cent from every bank account in the world ought not to do that, even though it won't hurt anyone and he can get away with it, but there is an objective reality in the world that stealing is bad. Taking something from someone that's not yours is a bad thing to do. Therefore, you ought not to do it. For example, what are some examples of those really basic oughts or goods? Something like, all things being equal, everyone should be merciful, whether or not they think mercy is a good thing or not. I think most people would probably agree with that. All things being equal, people should be merciful to each other. Who would disagree with that? Well, I don't know. If you're a nihilist or you're a moral relativist, you might say, oh, but that's just your culture and you evolved to do that because that's how the group survived and whatever, but it's not really true. But I think a lot of people have that intuition that if you are not merciful, then you've actually done something intrinsically wrong. Okay? And there are some cases where this becomes even clearer. So here is a statement that seems to be impossible to deny. it is always wrong to torture and kill an innocent baby for no reason. So I've had this discussion with lots of people, and sometimes people have tried to sort of come up with ways around it. Now, you can't cheat, okay? You can't fiddle and say, oh, but the baby was going to grow up to be Adolf Hitler or something, right? Because once you say that, you now have a reason, right? If he's going to grow up to be Hitler and I want to kill him, and anyway, you shouldn't torture him, you should still be merciful, but, that's a reason. No, what we're asking here is for no reason, just blindly, for no reason. Here's a baby, I don't know why, I'm just going to torture it and kill it. Is there really anyone, whatever their point of view about morality, who would say that statement is false? It's hard to see how you could do it. I'll just like an overview of the history of it. So in the second half of the 20th century, we had like the whole postmodernist thing, and this idea of moral relativity had its heyday, and it was very popular in lots of different fields, and even in the media and in culture and movies and songs and novels and everywhere. It was a very big thing. But the interesting thing is that in the last 20 years or so, maybe a little bit longer, there's actually been a very strong movement away from moral relativism, certainly in philosophy. Now, philosophers are the people who spend their days just sitting around thinking and talking about this stuff and writing some of it down, right? So this is like their job. They just sit there and think about it. And they're the ones who dig really, really deeply into these kinds of questions. Is there really an objective good or evil? They're the ones who dig really deeply. And the fascinating thing is, not on religious grounds. Okay, I want to emphasize that. On philosophical grounds, moral relativism has now become philosophically a very unattractive option. And there are some very strong voices arguing that it's simply just, it doesn't make sense. They're arguing it just collapses down into nihilism. So really the only two options you have either are nihilism or moral realism. They're the only two real options that you have. This is a quote from John Cottingham, he is a Christian philosopher, but he summarizes the recent trends. He's writing in 2009, but this is still true. It is very striking how the popularity of these subjectivist creeds has faded in more recent times. Relativistic views of truth turned out to be self-defeating. So just quickly, what he means there is, if you're a relativist about truth, if you're saying there's no such thing as truth and everybody makes it up for themselves, then that means your view that truth is relative is also relative. So you can't trust it. So it's self-defeating. You see that, right? While in ethics, which is what we're talking about today, morals, subjectivism ran into a host of logical difficulties, right? They're not religious, they're logical difficulties, and is now on the wane, eclipsed by a growing number of neo-objectivist theories. To everyone's surprise, the growing consensus among philosophers is that some kind of objectivism of truth and value is correct. Okay, this is a surprising trend. Nobody really expected this in the late 20th century, but this is where things have gone. And once again, this is Michael Ruse, who is an atheist philosopher. Just in case you think I'm cherry-picking the Christians, right? No, this is an atheist now. The point being made here is that morality seems to be objective. Rape is wrong, is not up for grabs in the way that I don't care much for broccoli and I'd rather be a philosopher than a sociologist are matters of taste. Rape is wrong is binding on all of us, even if, like the Russian soldiers, or I might add Gaijis, we can get away with it and no one is going to condemn us. Morality is a bit like the laws of nature in that it exists outside me and I am subject to it. Of course, it isn't always the case that I follow it, but that is another matter. Or in a stronger way, morality is a bit like the laws of mathematics, because morality seems to be about the world, not of it. So I find that stunning, right? This is someone who is not building this at all on the Ten Commandments or any kind of religious creed, but just philosophically has come to the conclusion, and this is a very common view now, that morality, that's amazing. It exists outside of me, and I am subject to it. Now, the atheist has a problem here. If you're going to reject both nihilism and relativism, if you're going to accept that things like torturing babies and the Holocaust are objectively evil, if you're going to accept that living in a nihilistic world is an objectively bad thing, why? Why is it bad? On what basis are you going to say this is bad rather than neutral or good? So this leads us now to the argument for morality, and we're going to answer this question hopefully as we go through, or subtitle, Why Morality Points to God. So if you don't believe that God exists, you are therefore left with the physical world, right? That's all that is real, that's all that exists, that's all that we are. We're just physical beings moving around in the world. Now remember what we said earlier on, that you can't get an ought from an is. And the physical world just is. There is nothing that ought to happen if all there is just the physical world, right? So how's the atheist going to get around this? They have to admit, as Michael Ruse did in that last passage, that there is something non-physical about reality. I'm not sure he was exactly doing that, but that's how I'm going to read him, just for convenience, right? When he says that there are moral truths, there are moral laws outside of us, and that we are subject to him, what is he talking about? He isn't talking about something made of atoms. He isn't talking something, that is a light wave or an energy wave or a gravity field or something like that. He's talking about something that is somehow not physical, at least not as we think of physicality today. Right? Something that is a law that governs the physical world, or at least a specific part of the physical world, which is you and me, creatures that can think about good and evil and make choices and make decisions about things. But the atheist has this problem. Where do I get this from? Where does this come from? How can I say this thing exists when all that exists is just the physical world, just what is? Where do I get the ought? Or they may just shrug their shoulders and say, well, it's a mystery. There is no answer. Now, the atheist has this problem, but the theist, the person who believes in God, doesn't have this problem. Because there is a really simple way to get oughts in a physical world if God exists. Objective morality is what is good for God. Where does the good come from? It is good for God, the Creator. So in a way, remember we said that good and evil are always good for someone or evil for someone. If it's good for me, it's just good for me. It's not for you or anyone else. If it's good for the human race, it's just good for the human race, not for anyone else. If it's good for God, who created the whole universe, then it is good for the whole universe. What is subjective for God, what is good for God, is objective for everything in the universe that he created. For us, it is an immutable law of nature. And that's right, that's sort of what I was alluding to. That actually does solve the problem in the sense that you have a reason why what is good in the world. And the reason is God himself. Now, I'm sure you're going to think of some objections to this, but hang on for a little while because we're going to address them, okay? I hope we're going to address them, we'll try. But before we do, I just want to sort of run by you this argument, okay? So, there is an objective good and evil. That seems to be what most philosophers are now tending towards. We seem to have good reasons to think that. The theistic worldview, the belief in God, can explain why there is an objective good and evil. A naturalistic worldview, one without God, can't account for the objective good and evil, and therefore it does follow logically, if those three premises are true, it follows logically that the theistic worldview is a better explanation for the evidence of what we see around us than an atheistic worldview. To put it sort of really simply, if positing the existence of God explains the fact we observe that there seems to be an objective good and evil, and if the lack of a God doesn't explain that fact, then all things being equal, we should prefer to believe that God does exist. So that's sort of roughly the argument that you can make. As I said, it's not just about whether it is true that this is good objectively or not. It's about what we do as well. It's about how we behave. It's about the actions. So there are some different theories of how you work out things, or how things come to be good or evil. How do we determine what is good and what is evil? What makes something good or evil? Where do goodness and evil actually come from? Why are they good or evil in the first place? So there's a number of different views. These aren't all of them. There are others you could also come up with, but these are very popular ones. So you might say that good is just what God commands to be good. If God says this is good, therefore it is good. If God says this is evil, therefore it is evil. That's called divine command theory. You don't have to worry about the blue column if you don't like, if you don't want to get worried by big new terms. Christian naturalism just says it's not about what God commands, but it's about the very nature of God himself. What is good is what reflects the nature of God. What is evil is what distorts or goes against the nature of God. Or virtue ethics says that good is what makes you virtuous. Or some people do it the other way around. To be virtuous is to do good and to be good inside. Deontology is the good is what is your duty to do. So this is the idea that there is something intrinsically in the world that imposes an ought upon you. It is your duty to be merciful. It is your duty to be kind. And therefore, goodness is when you do those kinds of things, right? And if you don't do them, that's what evil is. And then there's consequentialism or utilitarianism, a variety of it. Goodness is decided by the consequences of actions. So, for example, you might want to say, good is what is best for the greatest number of people. And that's how you decide what's good and evil. But notice that of those 5 models, only the first 2 actually include some kind of an attempt to explain what it is that makes something good or evil, right? Think about good is what is best for the greatest number of people. That's just a way of working out whether this action should be called good or bad. It doesn't tell you why it is good or bad. It just tells you how to decide if it is, right? Because you know the famous trolley problem. There's a train coming down a track and the track forks, and if the train keeps going, it will kill 5 people who are working on the track. If you switch the train to the other track, there's just one person there who'll get killed. Okay, so a utilitarian will say it is better to save 5 lives than to save 1 life. Okay, that helps us to determine, although people still argue about it up until today, whether that's really the right answer, but we have a way of determining what is the good action, to let the train keep going or to shift the train. It doesn't tell us anything about why saving life is a good thing in the first place. It says nothing about why human life should be valued. It assumes that human life should be valued, and then tells you if you have these consequences, then you do it quantitatively and things like that, or sometimes qualitatively as well, I suppose. And the same goes with virtue ethics and deontology, whether it be about being a virtuous person or what is your duty to do. There's nothing in there that tells you why doing your duty is a good thing or why being virtuous is a good thing. The other 2 do. The other 2 use that argument that I just went through, that we have the theist has a justification for why something is good. and that justification is God himself. I'm going to try and preempt some of your questions, but I'm sure you're going to come up with others. You might ask, is it possible for a person to be good without believing in God? So what do you think? Yes or no? Yes, of course it is possible for someone to be good without believing in God, just in the same way if good and evil are objective and real parts of reality, just like gravity, right? A person who doesn't believe in gravity can still fall over. They will still hurt themselves because they fell over, even if they don't believe in gravity, because it's part of life. It's just intrinsic in our life. So I think, yeah. And in fact, I would even say, and you may disagree with me on this, I would say that the atheist who strives really hard to be good is in many ways more noble than the religious person who strives to be good. Because the religious person actually knows why the good is good, right? The atheist, if I'm right in what I said earlier, can't actually get an ought from an is, right? All they can say is the physical world exists, but do you know what? I'm still going to be good. And I think that's actually a very noble thing. I think that's a very admirable thing. Question 2. Could God have chosen to make the world such that things we consider intrinsically evil, like murder, were actually objectively good? Could God have made the world so that one of the 10 commandments was, thou shalt murder? Is that possible? It depends on which of these first two views you hold. If you hold divine command theory, if you say that what is good is just what God commands, then you would have to say yes, because God could have commanded murder to be good, because whatever he says is what is good. If, on the other hand, you hold to Christian naturalism, the idea that good is just what is the nature of God, then God had to be what he is. He is the definition of goodness, and therefore he can't be anything different. You know, he can't behave like the devil. He would cease to be God, you know, if he did that. If he is God, then he can't be something else. Lots of Christians live immoral lives. How can their God be the source of objective good? Is this a good argument? So, you know, Christians say there is objective good because it's the nature of God and that's reflected in the world. But then when you look at the people who actually believe in that good God, when you look at how they actually live their lives, you see an awful lot of evil going on. Crusades and inquisitions and witch hunts and, you know, all horrible things, hypocrisy and judgment and persecutions and colonialization and misogyny and all kinds of horrible things, right? Oh, well, hang on, this doesn't work. The whole thing must be wrong, right? Just because people apply something badly doesn't mean the thing itself is wrong. Okay, to summarize my bit for tonight then, good and evil are always for someone, and you can't derive an ought from an is. You can't just describe the way something is, and from that alone get to, and this is what you ought to do about it. And yet today, philosophers are converging on the view that there seem to be objective moral truths. There are things that are intrinsically good and evil, regardless of what anybody thinks about them. And I think there is a good argument that one can make from that, that if you believe in God, you actually have a way of explaining where those intrinsically good or evil principles come from. It is the nature of God, the reflection of the nature of God. If you don't believe in God, you don't really have a good answer. You're either going to fall back into nihilism, which mostly people today reject, or you're going to have to just pretty much shrug your shoulders and say, we don't know yet. To which the Christian would respond and say, okay, but here's an answer. You know, and it is coherent, whether you think it's true or not. It certainly is, like, it fits, it works. So ultimately, good derives from the nature of God. That's what we're saying, and A little reminder there for me to remind you, if you found this interesting, this is actually a bit from one of the lectures in the apologetics course at St. Cyril's. So I encourage you, there are many fascinating and interesting units to study at St. Cyril's. And I don't get a commission, I promise you. But do look up the St. Cyril's website. There's lots of really good, and you know, if you're not in Sydney or whatever, you can do it online and so on. That's my ad for the night.